Good morning, church. It's been great so far. Yeah. Before I begin, I want to tell you how much my wife and I appreciated that pastor's gift last week. And we're going to use it this week. Gave it a nice little card for Olive Garden, and we appreciate that very much. Feel the great love from you people, and we love you, and it's been a great journey so far. We're going to continue it. If you've looked at your bulletin, and you've heard a little bit what I just said a little while ago, we're going to talk about restoration today. Restoration. A beautiful picture of grace. Let's talk about this word restore here for a bit, because it involves a process where something that's old and worn out is made new again. Wouldn't it be nice if we could all get new again, huh? Well, doesn't work out that way too well. But let me give you some background. I'm a car guy. I have had a romance with cars all of my life. And I come by it natural. I was just a little guy. My brother and I, we lived on a hill in one of the places where my father pastored. And it was a tall hill. It came down from up here, and it leveled off, and then it went back down some more. So we would build these little derby cars. And that's not a big deal, except that my derby cars never would outrun his, because I had to have all of the bells and the whistles. You know, he took this long plank, and he found some lawnmower wheels. They got good ball bearings in them, those old-fashioned lawnmower wheels, with that push kind, you know. And so he put some lawnmower wheels on it, and put a place to park his little rear end on it, and then he steered it with a rope in his feet. And that thing would fly. I had to get this flat board, and then I had to build a body, and then I had to find some metal and make cover. You know, I had to do all this stuff. You know, I'm building a car. I'm not just building a board. I'm building a car. And of course, I'd never beat him to the bottom of the hill. I'd get there, but I'd never beat him because it was too heavy. But that was my beginning with this romance with cars. And as I got older, I learned how to drive tractors, and I learned how to drive old farm pickups out in the country. We pastored in country churches, and farmers always had those old Ford pickups. You know what I'm talking about, the old green Fords. And I'd go out and drive around the hills, learn how to drive. That way I couldn't get anybody in trouble. The pasture was so huge, there's no way I could get hurt. And so that's how I learned how to drive. And then I started getting my own cars. As I got older, got my driver's license. So I've always had cars. If I had the time today, I'd put a whole bunch of pictures on the wall of some of the cars that I have restored. And I got a bunch of them that I restored. I don't have them now, but I did have. And one of the things about restoring cars is that you don't paint over rust. I tried that a few times, found that didn't work. Rust's still there. So you have to kind of take them apart and clean them up and then put them back into what they were from when they were new. Takes a lot of time. Nowadays it takes more money than time, because now you can just go out and buy the pieces and stick them on. But there we had to scour wrecking yards and buy sandpaper, and take hammers and beat on them, and, you know, all kinds of stuff. Because that makes, you know, I'm kind of dating myself now. I'm pretty old. But that's what restoration is all about. It's a process of tearing something down and building it back up to either better than or as good as it was. Well, this is kind of what God wants to do with you and me, because he loves us so much. And He's in the business of restoring you and me. You see, when we said this before, we are people in progress and process. We are growing as we continue to surrender our lives to Him, and He puts His fingers on various things in our lives that we need to kind of prune off and let Him do the pruning. Then we continue to grow. Well, there's 4 words that describe how great our God is. We're going to major on these today. First word is called grace or gracious. The next one is loving. And then just or justice. And then mercy. Now, while I use tools to do my restoration process, these 4 words are the tools that our God uses, His attributes, in the process of restoring us to Himself and then us to each other. You see, in this restoring process to Himself, He needs to fix you and me first. I can't do very much for anybody else until I get myself aligned with Him. So He's got to fix me first. And that's what He wants to do with all these things. Now notice, this word grace, it's an interesting word. Oh, I know. Ask people what grace means, and they'll say, well, God's unmerited favor toward us. Well, that's true. We didn't deserve it. But grace runs to seek us, runs to find us. Yeah, it is His unmerited favor, but it's the free gift to those who deserve the exact opposite. We don't deserve His grace. We didn't do anything to earn it. Not at all. And when we were without hope and without God, He sought us out. It's a 5-letter word in grace. It's spelled Jesus. Because, see, He was the perfect human picture of grace, love, and truth. In John 1, and we've been in John for a while, but that's not where we're going to be today, but I'm going to use this to... Here's what He said. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I've read this before to you. He was with God in the beginning. And then verse 14. The Word became flesh. God became Jesus, became a man for us. The Word became flesh, made His dwelling among us. We have seen His glory, and the glory from the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And then verse 17. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. That's where it came from. And folks, in your life and in my life, the reason why we can hold our head up and thank God for what He's done for us is because grace happened to you and to me. Paul says it this way in Romans 5:15. The free gift is not like the offense that brought the gift, because by one man's offense many died, but because of the grace of God, by the gift of grace, Jesus Christ came, or the word says, abounded to many. Adam failed, brought sin on the whole world. Jesus came to bring grace to the whole world. Grace also is an action thing. Grace acts. For by grace, it says, You have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. Oh, that's in Ephesians 2:8. I can't save myself. I can't make grace myself. He bestows the grace into my life. And it only can come from God, no matter what we have done, no matter what the depth of our transgressions or the darkness of our hearts. Grace overrules. God continues to pursue us relentlessly. And as the chorus says, He never gives up, and it never runs out once He captures us. Grace is so infinite from the beginning, back before we ever were, infinite and forever and transcendent. It passes all of our understanding. We can't even possibly understand what grace has done for us. And whenever you are feeling like it isn't worth living, that it isn't worth trying anymore, that God doesn't do what I want Him to do, you stop and realize for a minute, if it wasn't for grace, you wouldn't be here. And that kind of should change our minds a little bit about whether we're ready to give up or not. Here's what 1 Peter said in chapter 5, verse 10. He is, talking about God, He is the God of all grace, and He is abounding with mercy to the merciless, and help for the helpless, and redemption for everyone. That's part of His process of restoration. The next word here is love. Because His love took Him to the cross and held Him there in spite of what it cost. It says in Romans 5:8, God showed His love toward us in that while we were still lost in our sins, He sent Jesus Christ to die for us. Another place it says, for scarcely would for a good man you or I would die. But He did it knowing what we were. He knew what we were before He even made us. And then He stood by and saw the sinner we became. And He loved us. Then there's the word just or justness. God will always be fair with you and me. He's never unfair. But He won't wink at our sin. It's kind of like I said a little bit earlier about the restoration process. You don't paint over rust. God doesn't just kind of whitewash our sin. He wants to remove it. He wants to take it away. He wants to make us like Him. What do you tell the lady that He spoke to who had been found in adultery, and they were going to throw rocks at her and stone her to death because that's what the law called for? Catch a person in adultery and you're going to throw rocks at them and kill them. And what about the lame man who couldn't walk? How did Jesus restore them? First of all, He looked at the lady sitting there on the ground with the guy standing there with the rocks in her hands and said, wrote down something in the sand. They all read whatever it was He wrote. I don't know what He wrote. But all of a sudden, you started hearing these pop, 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 all the rocks hitting the ground. And He turned to the lady and He said, where's your accusers? And she looked around, I don't know. He said, neither do I condemn you. Go, don't whitewash it, go and quit your life of sin. That's not painting over the rust. That's exposing it. He said, go fix it now. The lame man couldn't walk. He looked at the lame man, and the guy came because he felt like Jesus could do something for him. What did Jesus do? He looked at him and He said, your kind of faith, your sins are forgiven. Now get up and leave the life that you had before. You see, what He was basically saying was, Get your act together. That's what he says to anybody who comes to him for forgiveness. He says, I will forgive you because I love you, because I died on the cross for you. Now get your act together. And that goes for whether you're 85 or 5 or 25. If we're going to be new, we have to let him come in and change us. We don't have to worry about the rocks being thrown. We just walk with him now. And now the word mercy. Mercy extends to us in the face of our sin. In the midst of all of what we have done or thought or acted, mercy sees it, which is Jesus. Mercy sees it, and he forgives us. And grace comes along, which is the same Jesus, and heals it. Now, a lot of times we think about mercy and grace being the same. And they are connected. We know that. But we still see it written so many other places. Mercy and grace. Grace and mercy. The connection they have is interesting. Because you see, grace is the bridge. Grace is the bridge that goes across the open chasm, the canyon, if you would, between God's holiness and our wickedness. And he stands on the side and says, come on across. Come on over. The bridge is strong enough to hold you. And it's very interesting how that bridge seems to take the shape of a cross. A cross that he died on. That's why we can walk across the bridge. You know, mercy and grace in the Old Testament talk about that. Mercy is God withholding the punishment that we rightfully deserve. That's mercy. Grace is not only God withholding the punishment, but offering the greatest gift of all, forgiveness, restoration. He doesn't look at what we were. He looks at what we can become because of his grace. He knows what we were. That's why he has the mercy. That's why he put the bridge across the chasm. That's how that works. Well, now it's time to think about restoring. Once he has restored us this way, now he wants to restore us to each other. Now we're ready to work on our own relationships and with the others in our families. Whoops, Pastor, you don't even want to talk about that, do you? All of us. Excuse me, I'm going to move this before I knock it over. There we go. All of us have or have had family tensions. There's a story in the Old Testament. Let me tell you a Bible story. Now, it's going to be a quick one, but I'm going to tell you a Bible study. Over in Genesis chapter 37, we are introduced to the story of Joseph. Anybody know who Joseph was? Who knows who Joseph was? Okay. Joseph was the second to the youngest son of Jacob. The youngest son was Benjamin. Joseph was a favorite. You know, some parents, I guess, they had 12 brothers. Or 11 brothers, I should say. And Jacob had a favorite. He loved Joseph. Something special about Joseph. Who knows? Maybe he looked like his mother. I don't know. But He loved Joseph very special. He was pleasant to look at. Tells us that in the scriptures. He was very pleasant to look at. He was very, very good-looking young boy and a very handsome young man. And Jacob did things for him that he didn't do to the other guys. The other guys were older, and they were all out working in the flocks and the fields and all this. He loved him so much that he made him this real pretty coat, just a gorgeous coat, had all kinds of colors on it, every color of the rainbow. And of course, Joseph, he'd put that thing on, he'd parade it around in front of his brothers. And Joseph was a dreamer. He saw visions and dreamed dreams. And I'm not making that some kind of a supernatural thing. It's just that's the way he was. He was a dreamer. Everybody has their special dreams when they're kids, being a, whatever. And he had a couple of dreams, and one day, these dreams, he put on his coat, and he was walking around with his brothers, and he told his brothers about this dream, and he had a couple of dreams, and the gist of the dreams were that they were going to eventually bow down to him. The sheaves of grain that bent over, and they represented his brothers, and it was kind of like he was sticking it to him. He really wasn't, but he's just a dreamer. That he was going to be big and great. He had no idea. This isn't something spiritual here. That's just the way he was. And it infuriated him. They hated the coat, because that showed favoritism. And they hated his dreams, because that made out like the little brother was going to be the ruler of the big brothers. And they didn't like that. Well, Jacob sent the brothers out into the field, take care of the sheep. And he hadn't heard from him for a while, so he sent Joseph. He said, Joseph, I want you to take this food and take it out to the brothers. Okay. So he took it out there. You got to run through this thing quick so we don't run out of time. He took it out to them, and they saw him coming from a long way off. And guess why? It was because that coat just lit up. They could see him coming. And one of the brothers turns and says, here comes the dreamer. We just don't like him, but we got to do something with him. Well, somebody said, well, let's kill an animal, and then let's kill him, and then we can dip the blood, and say that an animal tried to get him, and we got the animal, but in the process, the animal got him first. One of the brothers, Reuben, said, nah, I don't like killing my brother. I don't like doing that. So he said, I know where there's this old cistern. A cistern is a dry well, a hole in the ground where rainwater and stuff runs in, fills up, so they can have water. He said, I know where there's this cistern, and let's do this. Let's go ahead and kill the animal. But then let's dip his coat in that. We'll put him down in the cistern. His idea was, we'll put him down in there, and we'll take the coat back and tell Dad he got killed by an animal. But he was going to sneak back later and take him out, because he didn't want to kill his brother. Well, that's a pretty good story, huh? So I learned that in Sunday school. Of course, all they ad lib is something else. In the meantime, here comes a caravan across the desert, and they're heading toward Egypt. And so I said, I got just the idea. Let's take him out of the cistern and let's sell him to those guys. We can probably get a lot of money for him. So they did. They took him out and sold him to that caravan of traders that was going across the desert, and then did their dastardly deed about telling Dad what happened. Of course, Dad was wrought, just sick and angry, frustrated. Why his brothers hadn't taken care of it. He really was mad at them. Joseph gets into Egypt, and then the rest of the story is just an outstanding story of honor and integrity and decency of a man that, in spite of the fact that he was a dreamer, and that he was different. God had his hand on him, and there was a reason for it. We all know the reason. If we've studied the Old Testament, we know the reason that God had his hand on Joseph. While he was there, the dreaming part of his life began to come to fruition, and he was able to interpret dreams for the king, Pharaoh. But he worked for Potiphar. Potiphar was one of the chief captains of the guard. And Potiphar's wife really liked what Joseph looked like. She liked him. And she wanted him for herself. And she would try and try and try to get him to do bad things with her. Joseph wouldn't do it. And that scorned her. Boy, she didn't like that at all. She didn't like somebody refusing her. So one day when she caught him alone, she tried to grab him and pull him into her room, and his coat came off. Not the coat of many colors. That was already gone. His coat came off, and he ran. And then she ran and told Potiphar that he had done this to her. He ended up in prison. Interpreted a dream and got out of prison. I'm abbreviating the story here. Now he has been put in charge of, actually second in command in Egypt. The dream he interpreted was about the 7 years of good, plentiful food, and then 7 years of intense famine. There wasn't going to be anything to eat anywhere in the land. And so they were to take all of the good food. Just what he said, take all the good stuff and put it into barns and save it for the day of famine. And when it came, then he was in charge of doling it out to the people who lived around the area. Well, his brothers and his dad and his family, they lived in the area where there was famine. They had nothing to eat. Well, they knew about Egypt, so they went to Egypt. They didn't know Joseph was there. It's been years now. They weren't sure if he was still there or if he was dead. The beautiful story that we find in the process, and of course the Bible story goes on and talks about going back and forth and all this kind of stuff. But chapter 45 is the climax to it. And Joseph has seen his brothers. They've come in to him to get food. Wasn't that interesting? That's what the dream said they were going to do one day. Try to get something because he was going to be in charge. They didn't know who Joseph was. They didn't recognize him. But he recognized them. Here's the beautiful story of restoration. Joseph recognized his brothers, and he started to cry. He cried loud enough that Pharaoh heard it out here. And then he came and he said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And when they had come, he said, "I am your brother, Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt." See, they were terrified. They didn't know who he was. "And now do not be distressed, or do not be angry with yourselves for selling me, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. You meant it for my bad, but God meant it for my good." And instead of sending them out and having their heads taken off, he loved them. But now he's got to go back. They got to go back to their father. And they got to tell their father what's going on. And he's still furious at those brothers. He didn't disown them, but he's still angry at those brothers. And his anger, his bitterness is there. And he said, "Go and tell my father to come down to me." They went back and told him. He was stunned. And his words were this. And he said, "I am convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Now, you want to talk about a story. If you want to read that whole thing, get into chapter 37 of Genesis and read the entire story, and it'll give you all the details. I just given you a nutshell look at it here. It's a beautiful story of redemption and restoration of a family. Now, I don't know where we are in our families, but if we've ever had any kinds of things in our families where we have become estranged, God's in the restoration business of fixing us. You see, God engineers or works with the difficulties in our lives for our good and His glory. God works in our lives. He will use the trials and the difficulties and the reverses and the hurts and the pains to make you better if you respond to His love and His grace. Family relationships are some of the toughest. Estrangement, broken homes, broken relationships. You know, and I understand that some problems and some relationships are beyond fixing. I understand that. I get that. My job isn't to decide what is not fixable, what is not restorable. My job is to trust Him and leave the results to Him. That's my job. That's your job. I don't see how that guy could ever, or that woman could ever, or that kid could ever what? Does God not love them? Does His grace not go out to them? Yes, it does. I can't make it happen. You can't make somebody do something they don't want to do. But when you bring God into the scene, a lot of things can change. We release them to God and we trust Him for the results. And we don't hold grudges. And we never maintain bitterness. The Bible tells us, do not allow the root of bitterness to spring up and grow in you. It'll destroy it. Bitterness destroys. Holding grudges destroys. We don't have to do that. Let me give you some things here about mercy and grace. Mercy withholds the knife from the heart of Isaac. Remember the story of Isaac and Jacob? Grace provides the ram in the thicket. Who would have thunk it? Mercy runs to forgive the prodigal son. Grace throws a party with extravagance. Mercy bandages the wounds of the man beaten by the robbers, and grace covers the cost of the recovery. Mercy hears the cry of the thief on the cross, and grace says, this day you'll be with me in paradise. I love that. Mercy pays the penalty for my sin on the cross. Grace substitutes the righteousness of Christ for my wickedness. Mercy converts Paul on the road to Damascus. Grace calls him to be an apostle. Mercy closes the door to hell. Grace opens the door to heaven. Mercy withholds what we have earned, but grace provides blessings with what we haven't earned. You see, He does things right because He is the master artist. That's restoration, folks. That's not painting over the rust. That's getting rid of it. And the master artist makes all things beautiful again. There's a song I'm going to close with that just really brings all this right down where it needs to be. You listen. These are good. He knew what I was when he made me. He saw the sinner I'd become. Yet he knew he had grace that could save me. His latest work of art had just begun. He started with an old, dirty canvas. My sin left me tattered, bent, and marred. Then an artist turned his light upon my sadness and began to wash away the blackest part. When all the stains were gone, he started painting with colors I'd never seen before. And with joy now he was ready to display me, to show the world what the cross was for. A masterpiece of mercy, a miracle of grace. When the master sees one hurting, he wipes the pain away. The canvas of the artist becomes a holy place for the masterpiece of mercy, a miracle of grace. Now I'm getting ready for heaven. Every day just makes me want to go. But the artist hasn't stopped. He's still painting. And when he's finished, he'll take me home. A masterpiece of mercy, a miracle of grace. When the master sees one hurting, he wipes the pain away. The canvas of the artist becomes a holy place for a masterpiece of mercy, a miracle of grace. The canvas of the artist becomes a holy place for a masterpiece of mercy is a miracle of grace. That's restoration, folks. Jesus, thank you for what you've done with our lives. And continue to do the painting. You're not done yet. But when it's done, what a beautiful picture of your grace. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.
There are 90 million registered Christian voters in America.